Robert Bropho was a terribly flawed man, but for many years he was known as a prominent campaigner for Indigenous rights. In Perth, the former Swan Brewery buildings had been built in 1838 on land containing a number of sacred Aboriginal sites, particularly the resting place of Waugal, a Dreamtime serpent who created the Swan River. In 1966, the brewery moved to more modern premises. By the late 1980s, the Western Australian government instructed a state government instrumentality, the Western Australian Development Corporation, to redevelop the site into a commercial precinct. The Aboriginal Heritage Act 1972 made it unlawful to interfere with sites of cultural significance for Indigenous people without authorisation from the relevant minister. The Development Corporation didn't have such an authorisation, and Robert Bropho sued. The corporation's defence was that there is a presumption in statutory interpretation that legislation does not bind the Crown. In other words, the starting assumption is that legislation does not bind government agencies or government bodies. This presumption makes practical sense in many cases. For instance, soldiers need not hold a weapons licence. But over time, the principle that nobody, not even the government, should be above the law came to take on more importance. Prior to this case, the rule was that the presumption would only be displaced by a very clear intention by the Parliament that the Crown should be bound. In this case, however, the High Court found that there was no basis for imposing such a stringent requirement. If the Parliament intended to bind the Crown, and if the Court could identify that intention from the words of the statute, that should be enough. The majority judges said, a legislative intention to bind the Crown may be disclosed, notwithstanding that it could not be said that the intention was manifest from the very terms of the statute, or that the purpose of the statute would otherwise be wholly frustrated. If such an intention was disclosed, that intention must be given effect. As a result, in contemporary statutory interpretation, if there is any ambiguity as to whether the Crown is bound, the Court must examine the statute as a whole, including things like extrinsic materials, to determine whether the Parliament intended for the Crown to be bound. Bropho won this battle, but he lost the war. A ministerial authorisation was granted, the redevelopment took place, and the commercial precinct remains in operation.